think it's about to go live. It's always hard for me to. There we go. I I've been meeting random times over Zoom with a number of different kinds of organizations and leaders and pastors as we all kind of reflect on what it looks like to respond to the pandemic that's around us, what leadership looks like, what decisions look like. And a week ago, I was on a Zoom call, and it was pastors from 9 or 10 different churches, all that have an association with this other nonprofit. Some of them it's the church holistically does, some of them it's just personally that they support that nonprofit. And there was a bunch of us, and they were talking. And the nonprofit, their president and their executive director, were talking about how they're helping to still work to help with injustices around the world, what the pandemic looks like as it hits third world countries, and how that's different when they're told to shelter in place, and sheltering in place to them doesn't look like a comfortable home with internet access and refrigerators full of food, and how that's different from the experience we have as we think about sheltering in place. And as we were talking as a group, one of the things that stuck out to me was an illustration that executive director used. He was talking about the way we've gotten accustomed to doing ministry and our own life and our own relationship with God and His people, and how patterns of luxury or how history of blessing has made some of that normal and expected for us, and yet the reminder that he was offering was that that's not what God needs. That to work in our world, to do ministry in our world, to meet needs in our world, God doesn't need us to do that from a place of abundance. And he was using that as an illustration primarily from the feeding of the 5,000. So I'm going to look at that today as just a thought that's stuck with me since that meeting a week ago, about the miracle of Jesus feeding the 5,000 and how that in some way can relate to a perspective we may choose during a time of crisis and pandemic. Here's how that story begins in Matthew chapter 14. Jesus went with his disciples, and they were in a remote place, and a crowd had gathered. And he had compassion on them, and he healed their sick. As evening approached, verse 15 says, the disciples came to him and said, Jesus, this is a remote place, and it's already getting late. Send the crowds away so they can go to the village and buy themselves food. Jesus, there's a normal way this is supposed to work, and these people are going to be hungry, and the way we're used to seeing food provided is dismissing people to go to the places where food normally is. This is the way needs get met. This is what's normal for us as a people. And Jesus replied, they do not need to go away. You give them something to eat. And the disciples look at each other, I imagine, and they say, we have here only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, they answered. This isn't going to be enough to feed this large crowd. The resources that we're used to aren't there. Bring them here to me, he said. And he directed the people to sit down on the grass, and taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke the loaves, and then he gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the people. They all ate and were satisfied, and the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. And the number of those ate, who was about 5,000 men, besides women and children. Now, this director of this nonprofit, he was saying, hey, as particularly as Americans, as our relationship with the church, as our relationship with God, as our relationship with how we help around the world has gone, we've been used to doing this with an abundance of resources. The analogy he would use would go on to say, we've been feeding the crowds, but we've always had 500 loaves of bread. It's easy to feed the crowd of 5,000 if you've got 500 or even 5,000 loaves of bread. And yet we've hit this pandemic, and where nonprofits are seeing hits to what their giving looks like and what budget looks like, and resources are hard to come by. And he says, what we need to recognize is that while we've gotten accustomed to doing ministry and life that way, is that isn't the only way God's ever met people's needs. We serve a God who meets the needs of the thousands with the resources that are very few, that there's a multiplication that happens, that as we turn our eyes towards heaven, we see the little resource still reach all of the people that need to be reached. And his hope in talking to us pastors was to have this understanding that their ministry still has an aim to see all of the needs they've been meeting be met, even if their giving and their budget is reduced, to find new creative ways to see God multiply those resources, because we have a God who can still take 5 loaves of bread and feed the thousands and have plenty left over. And so just because we suddenly look around and say, hey, we don't know if we have the resources, maybe we need to send everybody away, maybe we need to tell them to find everything, maybe we need to figure out a new way for them to get food, in the analogy, that the encouragement was, what if instead we just look to heaven and we say, hey, we have very little to offer in comparison to what is normal for us, and yet we're hoping you'll magnify it and reach great amounts of people with it. As I've been thinking about it, it to me ended up applying in my life, not just as it related to like leading a ministry or leading a church or meeting the needs of a group of people. I've started asking the same question just about having the lens of who God is and his ability to meet needs and accomplish the things he's aiming to accomplish here on earth with resources that we don't understand. And so there's times where in my own life I've started to think, man, if some of the kinds of resources that I was used to having, a small group that met in person and shared prayer requests in really intimate ways, aren't able to meet in the same way right now, how do I say, yeah, but I don't need to have all of the resources I've always had. Maybe God wants to meet this need uniquely as I turn my eyes towards heaven. Maybe you sit and you think, yeah, but a bunch of my growth in the way that I value my faith came from classes that a church was offering or a ministry like BSF was offering, and it's looked different to not be able to engage with those things in the same way. Those resources aren't there. Maybe what we need to have is a lens that says, hey, God, maybe what I don't need is just to long to go back to a place of luxury and blessing where all my needs are getting met by the resources I understand. But maybe I need to turn my eyes towards heaven and see God multiply what is still in my life. And so maybe my own daily Bible reading starts to fill me in a way that it hasn't recently needed to. Because I had that mixed with times of prayer with other groups, mixed with times of growing in classes, mixed with times of connection in live places, mixed with opportunities for women's ministry or men's ministry or workout ministry or prayer ministry or whatever those things would be, that we say, even without all of those resources that are good and healthy and normal, and we long for them to return, for things to look easiest for us and comfortable for us and impactful for us, maybe what we recognize is that in this moment we can have a lens that says, yes, but I serve a God who doesn't need the 5,000 loaves, doesn't need the 500 loaves, just needs the 5 loaves. And God, then as a response to my own life, just be asking, can you multiply the efforts that I do get to engage with to fill me in a way that I've relied on other resources for before? God, can you use our Sunday worship experiences, whether physically or digitally engaging with those, to give me strength and energy and sustenance in a magnified way because we turn our eyes to you? And so where some of those other supplemental ministries might not be as easy to find right now, can you multiply the resource that's there in a way that fills me? And I've been thinking through that, what that looks like in my own life. God, how do I find strength and encouragement? How do I find energy and value in what is present instead of just longing for what's missing, instead of trying to make the plan to figure out just how we get all of it back as quickly as possible? How do we turn our eyes to heaven and say, God, I know this is enough. That as you would imbue this with your power and your presence and your spirit, that this would magnify. Not only would it be enough, but we'd be able to turn around and say, there's even some left over. I can find more value than what I thought. There's even some left over. All the needs can be met, and there's some left over. The challenge was, by that director, he just said, hey, maybe we just recognize as leaders of churches and of ministries, as people of God ourselves, that we need to go back to a season where God has to do lots with the little or few loaves that are available, instead of us making the plan to disperse everybody to all the resources that we've been accustomed to. So I don't know what that looks like in your life. I'm still figuring out a lot of what it looks like in mine, but I've been having this consistent prayer, and maybe it's a prayer or ask or a request to God that you could use as well, just to say, God, what I'm recognizing right now is the resources look different, but that you don't need the mass of resources to grow my relationship with you or to impact the world around us. You can take the small amount of resources and we turn our eyes towards you. You can multiply and magnify them to meet every need and have some left over. Please do that in our own lives. Please do that in our own faith. Please do that in our community of faith. And please do that as we aim to reach the world around us. Take the resources that are available, even if they feel small, and multiply them. That we aren't necessarily living right now from the place of luxury resources. We're living from the place of a luxury relationship with a God who meets our needs. Hope it's encouraging to you and valuable as you think about how God may be growing your relationship in this season as well. Grace and peace to you. Thanks for tuning in.